Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to 2022 WIPIC's online lecture and webinar series, Bridging the Gap, 50 Years of the World Heritage Convention. Our journey to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the convention has almost come to an end. This is the very last session of the series. I'm Harry Shim, the head of the Education and Networking Office for WIPIC, and I'm pleased to host this webinar today. So today, as it is the wrapping up session, we plan to talk about how we can tangibly enact the values that have been discussed so far into a reality. So under the theme of the directions of heritage interpretation in World Heritage Policy, 3 speakers will be joining the discussion today. Mr. Joseph King, a Senior Director of ICCROM, who has more than 30 years of career in the conservation and heritage, will give us his idea about World Heritage Policy on heritage interpretation and presentation. Dr. Gautam Talukdar from the Wildlife Institute of India, a UNESCO Category 2 center, will join as a discussant. And Dr. Hyun-Kyung Lee from Seogang University in Korea, whose research interest is on difficult heritage, will also participate in the discussion. For a more focused discussion, I will give you the brief summary of the previous sessions in the year's online lecture and webinar series this year. The overall encompassing theme was bridging or interlinking the values that were separated and isolated before. In the first webinar, we identified the major issues in the last 50 years of the World Heritage Convention, including regional imbalances, the surge of dissonant heritage, and the gap between the development and conservation. And it was suggested that the role of the heritage interpretation become more inclusive to embrace the regional and intangible values and to communicate with wider stakeholders. For the second session, Dr. Asian-Losen Odiawa from ICOMOS, Nigeria, delivered a lecture on human-nature coexistence through heritage interpretation. She spoke on how the values of cultural and natural heritage overlap and build off of one another. It was followed by Mr. James Carter's lecture to talk about bridging the disparity between the general public and the experts in the heritage area. As such, he discussed the public-friendly presentation of the sites. And finally, our journey led to Professor Neil Gamal Shapagan on interconnecting the intangible and tangible. He stressed that the heritage can be understood through various layers of culture, nature, and other socio-economic contexts, including collective memories. So based on these discussions, we will now begin our webinar with Joseph's speech on World Heritage Policy on heritage interpretation and presentation. Joseph, the floor is yours.
I hope you can hear me okay. Yes? Good. Okay, so thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you all today. I think I'd like to thank WPIC in the first instance. I think this series of webinars has been, I think, quite interesting. And I have to say, just in looking at your summary and seeing actually many good friends who have taken part in the previous webinars, I can say that I think this has been a very valuable series, and I'd like to thank WPIC for having organized it. In regard to today's discussion, which is the direction of heritage interpretation and presentation for World Heritage policies, I have to start out by being honest with all of you. There are no specific policies for interpretation or presentation within the World Heritage Convention. That is, there are no specific principles or guidance or processes that have been put together in a single policy document dealing with these issues of interpretation and presentation. I think in some ways this may be because it is felt that given the vastly different site typologies and the diversity of values and attributes associated with them, that it is difficult to develop a standard set of guidance. So having said that, though, that is not to say that the importance of presentation is not recognized in the World Heritage Convention, because it certainly is, and is something that is considered to be, I think, very, very important. You can see that simply just by looking at the text of the convention itself. In Article 4 of the convention, there is a mention of presentation, and it goes along with other elements of safeguarding of cultural and natural heritage, such as identification of that heritage, protection, conservation, and transmission to future generations. So presentation actually is considered to be an integrated part of the safeguarding of the world's cultural and natural heritage. It might be considered odd, therefore, that there's never been a substantive policy on the issue coming from the World Heritage Committee or from the General Assembly of States Parties. There is a question on the nomination form asking states parties when they nominate a site to describe their tourism and visitor facilities and any presentation infrastructure. But it leaves the question very open to states parties, and there's no guidance as to really what sorts of things the committee would be looking for in that case. Now, again, that doesn't mean the committee has never taken a decision dealing with interpretation or presentation, because they have on various occasions. But usually these decisions are aimed at a particular site, and they're limited to a more general request to a state party to develop an interpretation and presentation plan for that property, but without really being more specific as to what it is that they're looking for. If you're interested, I would just point you to the fact that on the World Heritage website, there is actually something called the Policy Compendium, and you can actually go and look, and you can see what policies the committee has adopted in the past, and also what case law they've adopted in the past in relation to particular decisions. So that might be useful for all of you that are looking at these issues more closely. In terms of our topic, however, the most interesting case law that has been produced by the committee on the issue of interpretation actually comes from the inscription of a site in Japan, the Meiji Industrial Revolution sites. And this was inscribed in 2015, and the committee decision specifically requested the state party, to prepare an interpretive strategy for the presentation of the property, which gives particular emphasis to the way each of the sites contributes to the outstanding universal value and reflects one or more of the phases of industrialization. But it also asks for this interpretation to allow for an understanding of the full history of the site, adding in a footnote that the World Heritage Committee took note of the statement made by Japan in regard to their the potential interpretive strategy, which allows for an understanding of the full history of the site. So I think that's an interesting decision or case law, let's say, coming from the committee, which is requesting states parties to emphasize the OUV, but also to look at the entire history, let's say, of the property when they're doing their interpretation and presentation strategies. Now, keep in mind, this is coming from 2015, and it's interesting to note that there was also an earlier decision at the 30th session of the committee in 2006, which took place in Vilnius in Lithuania, and it didn't deal with interpretation specifically, but it was part of a longer discussion on the issue of how we as professionals and how we as the public understand the concept of outstanding universal value. And this decision from the 30th session states that conscious that the outstanding universal value is a concept that shall embrace all cultures, religions, and regions and people, and does not ignore differing cultural interpretations of outstanding universal value because they originate with minorities, indigenous groups, and local peoples. The committee recognizes that the identification of outstanding universal value on the basis of established criteria needs to be analyzed and also in their cultural and natural context, and that in some instances, tangible and intangible interpretations cannot be separated. I'm talking about this because, in fact, this decision from 2006 talks about differing interpretations and the fact that we have to take into account a variety of different stakeholders, whether they be at the level of states parties, but also at the level of, as they say, minorities, indigenous groups, and local peoples. So I think this is an important concept that we need to keep in mind as we think more about the issue of interpretation and presentation. Of course, the only actual concrete reference to site presentation in the system is in the operational guidelines, and that's in section, I believe, 8 of the operational guidelines, which outlines the use of the World Heritage emblem. Now, this, of course, is not about the interpretation of the site itself, but rather about identifying and advertising a site as World Heritage. So clearly, this is not about what we're talking about in this webinar. This is not about how we understand and interpret and present the sites. Rather, what it is it's a way to advertise, I would say, the World Heritage status of a site and identifying a site as World Heritage. That is, however, part of the interpretation of the site. So I don't deny that that actually is an important aspect, but it's only obviously a very small aspect, identifying sites as World Heritage properties. In parentheses here, I will also note that UNESCO itself has just undergone a rebranding of its logo. It has a new logo out now. I guess many of you know that if you've gone to the website. So that section of the operational guidelines will actually need to be updated in the future. So I don't know if that presents an opportunity to also add other things related to interpretation and presentation. I don't know. Anyway, I asked myself when I was preparing for this presentation, I was asking myself, if there really is no policy that we can look at, where do we go? How do we actually look at what could be meaningful policies for World Heritage interpretation and presentation? So the first stop that I made was the ICOMOS Charter, because there is an ICOMOS Charter on interpretation and presentation of cultural heritage sites. It was adopted by the ICOMOS General Assembly in 2008 in Quebec. And that charter does lay out some very useful principles that are applicable not just to World Heritage sites, not just at the World Heritage level, but for all cultural sites. And I could even make an argument maybe for some natural sites, although that would be a discussion that we would have to have with our natural heritage colleagues. Now, to be honest with you, going back through that charter, and I've looked at it in the past, obviously, but in looking at it for this presentation, I went back, and I have to be honest with you, I'm not so happy with the definitions in that charter of interpretation and presentation. I think honestly that more work would probably need to be done. If we're going to do this at a policy level for World Heritage, I think probably more work would need to be done for us to be able to understand these terms in a more clear way, let's say. But otherwise, I think this charter is actually a very useful starting point for us. And in terms of the definitions, I'm hoping, or I would say that my understanding is that WPIC itself is actually doing some work in this area. If so, I would certainly encourage them to continue doing that, because I think it is important when we talk about interpretation and presentation. Oftentimes people don't really understand what it is that we're talking about. And so I think working on that and coming up with clear definitions, I think will be important. But again, having said that, the charter does lay out some useful principles that are applicable not just at the World Heritage level, but as I said, at all levels. At this point, I stopped and I said, well, but there really is no policy. So if I wanted to encourage the World Heritage Committee to take up a policy on interpretation and presentation, I would probably start with this ICOMOS charter as a starting point, but then I would actually look a little bit more at some of maybe the key issues or principles that a new policy should deal with. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the next five minutes to lay out what I consider to be a series of principles that we should be looking at when we think about a new policy for presentation, interpretation and presentation. So the first point, and this is one I've already mentioned, so I'm not going to go into it again, but is that there is a need for a clear definition of what we're talking about. What do we mean by interpretation and presentation? This, of course, is important because if we don't understand the words, it makes it much more difficult to actually develop meaningful policies in that respect. So again, I think that's probably the first work that we need to do in order to place it within the context of the conservation. We know what conservation means. In that list of identification, conservation, protection, etc. We know what a lot of those things are, but I think this presentation is the one that's maybe a little bit less clear at this point. So we need to work on that. My second principle would be a recognition that interpretation and presentation of World Heritage property actually already begins with the preparation of a nomination dossier. The collection of information and facts, as well as the identification of attributes and the creation of a convincing argument or narrative, are the first basis for interpretation of OUV. So already in the nomination dossier, it's there essentially what we're basing our interpretation on. And this notion of creating a narrative is an important one. I have often argued in the past to states parties that they should consider the nomination as a story outlining the site and why it has outstanding universal value. So again, it becomes a narrative that the state party is making to ICOMOS and to the World Heritage Committee as to why this site has outstanding universal value. And this story then becomes the basis for further interpretation. It's the first step. At the same time, the preparation of the dossier itself is a first presentation to ICOMOS and to the World Heritage Committee of this narrative. So you can even look at the nomination file itself as a presentation of the outstanding universal value of a particular property. So I think that's the first thing that we have to think about when we're developing a policy. Now, the third thing that I would look at is the fact that the outstanding universal value of the property and its attributes are only one of the layers of significance of the property. Of course, outstanding universal value and the significance attached to outstanding universal value is the one that is most directly the concern of the World Heritage Committee. But it is important to recognize that all the layers of significance it's necessary to understand all the layers of significance in order to ensure proper management and conservation of the property. So again, These layers may come from different stakeholders. And this is a concept that we at ECROM continue to develop within our people-centered approaches to conservation activity, which is part of the World Heritage Leadership Program. And we feel that it is of the utmost importance to recognize different levels, excuse me, different levels of significance and to manage a property, not just for its outstanding universal value, but for all of its values. And this is true in the case that I mentioned already in Meiji, but it's true of many sites around the world. And the one that I can think of is a site coming from my own country, the United States, Monticello in Virginia, in the United States, where much of the outstanding universal value is linked to the architecture of the place and Thomas Jefferson as the architect of the place. But in fact, actually, there's an entire history of that site dealing with slavery, dealing with its many roles in the formation of the United States that do need to be looked at. And while that may not be the outstanding universal value, we need to know that in order to interpret and present, and I would argue to conserve and protect that property. We need to have all of that information laid out. And I thought that's the only way that we can really protect a site and its values. Now, the fourth area is, or the fourth principle that I would use is, and it follows from this last one, that there's a need to look at multiple audiences, multiple stakeholders for interpretation and presentation, not just looking at tourists and what they may be interested in, but you have to actually consider local communities, you have to consider national audiences, you have to consider indigenous people. There's a whole series of people that need to be involved actively, both in the interpretation itself and as consumers, if I can use that word, of the presentation. I think it's very important that that people see themselves in the process of identification of this narrative and in the presentation of this narrative to a larger audience. So again, it's important that multiple communities, multiple actors, let's say, are involved both in the creation of interpretation and presentation, and also as users, as people who actually are involved in seeing the presentation, actually going to the site and understanding the values there. So that's the fourth principle. The fifth principle would be, and this is an important one, the work of interpretation and presentation is actually never completed. It has to involve the stakeholders, as I mentioned above, but it's an ongoing process of research, of interpretation, of reinterpretation as new research comes to light. And we need to recognize that we need to continue to improve our interpretation and continue to improve our presentation strategies. A lot of people think once you've done it, you never have to worry about it again. But I would argue that this is something that always is going to come back, and you need to keep looking at it as time goes on. The sixth principle that I would talk about is just the idea that presentation strategies can be developed both on-site and also can be utilized at a distance. I mentioned already that the nomination file itself is a presentation tool, let's say. So that's that's one area. But obviously, we also need interpretation on site. And that may include things like interpretation centers, signage, and things like that. But of course, now in what year are we in? 2022. There are also many other opportunities for interpretation, especially using computer-generated presentation. And that's something that can be seen off-site. It's something that can be seen even in the privacy of your own home. So I think that's actually a sort of a new way of thinking about interpretation and presentation. But one caution that I want to make on that is that it doesn't, you can't use computer-generated documentation as a replacement, let's say, for presentation on the site or conservation on the site. So, in the end, really what we need to be doing is protecting the property and conserving the property and its attributes. And I think we should be using these computer generated, let's say, presentation techniques as a way to enhance the on-site, the on-site presentation, and interpretation and presentation, but it shouldn't replace it. I think we need to recognize that there's a value in the actual place itself and in the actual material culture that's there. So I worry sometimes that people think, okay, well, once we've documented this, we don't need to worry about it anymore. We don't need to go there anymore. No, we still need to go there. We still need to conserve. So I think that's important. My seventh principle is that the on-site presentation should never interfere, however, with those key attributes of the property. So for example, if you're putting up signage, you need to make sure that it doesn't detract from our understanding of a building or of a place or a landscape. And so I think this is actually something that also is a very important aspect of presentation that we need to keep in mind. And finally, my last principle, and I think you would be surprised if Ikram would ever make a speech that didn't talk about capacity building. That's another area of I think of or a principle that we need to keep in mind in part of any interpretation and presentation strategy. That is that we need to ensure that we are working to build capacity of those people who are responsible for interpretation and responsible for presentation, to make sure that they're able to meet the needs of the site and to help us to understand the site in a better way, and to help visitors to understand the site in a better way. So these are my 8 principles, which I think could be the basis for a discussion of an eventual policy at the World Heritage level. These need to be broad enough to apply to all types of World Heritage sites, but they also need to be clear enough and concrete enough to be able to be used by the site management to be able to actually create this the presentation on site and off. It is my sincere hope that the work will continue in this area, certainly from WIPIC. And again, I've already thanked them, but I will thank them again for this webinar, but also for the work that they're doing on this topic of interpretation and presentation. And it's my hope that eventually the committee will take this issue up and develop a first policy on interpretation and presentation. So again, I thank WIPIC for picking up this important issue, and I look forward to progress to come in the future. Thank you very much for listening to me. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph, for your very insightful speech on the subject. You have identified and introduced the current policy environment regarding heritage interpretation, which at the moment, there are few policies except for the case law. And it's amazing that you prepared 8 principles and suggested to us. So according to your 8 principles, if we start with the clear definitions and the analysis of a nomination dossier and widen our perception of the OUV to the extended values, it could lead to the policy at the World Heritage level. And your guidance is also very relevant to the role and the task of WIPIC. Indeed, the research office of WIPIC is currently running a global working group on the definition and concepts of the heritage interpretation and presentation. And based on that, we'll be probably revisiting the ICOMOS charter for the heritage interpretation and presentation. And we are also planning our future capacity building programs as well. Thank you so much again for your deeply reflected speech. Okay, now let's listen to Gautam, his thoughts on Joseph's presentation.
Thank you, Harisham. And it was a wonderful presentation by Joseph. And some of the key takeaway points for me are basically interpretation is the key to making visitors care for heritage and take back lifelong memories. And it may need to be explicitly mentioned and explained, probably in a policy document or also in the World Heritage Convention, as the will to save is strongly linked to an emotional connection to the place. So we do not have a policy, and therefore somewhere I feel that we need to have a policy. Secondly, what comes is OUVs are not only the values, local values as well as regional values differ and may be much more important in many contexts. And it has also been reiterated by Professor Odior in her previous lecture. And in fact, I would like to also call upon Mr. James Carter from his previous talk, and also Joseph, he mentioned that we need to care about all the kind of stakeholders, not just hobbyists or explorers or the people who want to recharge themselves, but also purely experience seekers who may want to take a selfie if that's all they want. And in fact, here, Joseph also brought about the ICOMOS INAME Charter, as well as it was brought about previously by Professor Neil Chapakayan also, that this ICOMOS INAME Charter is available and there are certain principles that we can adhere to. Joseph got his own set of principles. Of course, many of them are overlapping. And most of them, fortunately, apply to the natural heritage of which I specialize in. So that's a very important piece of reference. I don't know whether it is actually in use, but we should definitely look forward to strengthening it and also including the natural heritage elements of interpretation in it. And the idea that interpretation is critical for support in times of limited funding should be thought about, and that narrative should be a part right from the nomination process, which Joseph mentioned. Coming to some specific points with respect to natural heritage, I would say that many times the expectations of visitors with natural heritage are quite unique. Example, expectations of a visitor to see certain animals may not always be met, which by contrast for physical remains of cultural heritage or monuments is always there. And therefore, we need to, have more of these computer generated contents through the use of metaverse or virtual reality or augmented reality. The technological fronts should definitely be explored so as to bring the experiences which may not be possible to be accessed in case of natural heritage sites, which require a person to be physically very, very fit. And lastly, I would want to conclude by stating that sometimes an experience like seeing a tiger or seeing a wild herd of elephants or seeing a unique phenomena does not need an interpretation, and we need to let it as it is, specifically in context to natural heritage. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gautam. So you have stressed that other heritage values is still very important other than OUV. And then current heritage interpretation should be more inclusive to natural heritage. And you have explained about the uniqueness of the natural heritage. So sometimes less interpretation is better interpretation. So thank you for sharing your thought, Gautam. Now, Hyun-kyung, can you also share your opinion on Joseph's speech?
Thank you, Harry. Above all, thanks WIPIC for organizing the timely and meaningful and intriguing webinar series to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the World Heritage Convention. As Ms. Shim Harry summarized in the beginning of the webinar, this webinar series have critically pointed out what the World Heritage has missed and which gaps we should be more carefully considered. So Joseph King's paper seems to be a good response to 4 previous lectures and how the interpretation and presentation policy can help to fill these gaps. I'd like to give comments on his paper with 3 particular points. First, although we acknowledge that the heritage interpretation and presentations are inseparable process in heritage, presentation seems to be dealt with less importantly compared to the discussion of interpretation. Therefore, Joseph King's paper reminds us of the significance of presentation, not only in the history of the World Heritage Convention, but also the interwoven relationship with the interpretation. And second, Joseph suggested the 8 principles. And then by focusing on the 8 principles, I'd like to pinpoint the particular word, complete story of the property that he used. He used a story instead of full history. I assume that he used it considering stories are formed by people. So he probably focused on the people-centered approach interpretation rather than national-centered interpretation. In addition, I understand complete the story of the property is as an ongoing process through the people's engagement in the dynamics between heritage interpretation and presentation. These help us clarify the role of interpretation and presentation as a listener of the people's stories and as an actor to embrace the multiple stories. So, and third, I'm very much impressed by his suggestion, principle 6, the presentation strategies. Presentation can be facilitated both on the site and be utilized at a distance. So as he noted, the heritage presentation is to be more focused in the heritage interpretation center on site. So there is some limited space physically. But these kinds of computer-generated spaces provide the diverse and ever-increasing interpretations as well. But however, we should be more considered that on-site visits seems to be give more serious impact on the visitors and people rather than online still. So we needed to think how we can interact that on-site visit, presentation, and computer-generated presentations. And meanwhile, we needed to think about the post-authenticity if we produce the digitalized presentation through the web or the other space. And meanwhile, I'd like to say that it's the time to respect diverse stories and embrace diverse values in the heritage interpretation and presentation. And we should think about people still need shared values to pursue through the heritage interpretation and presentation. So I hope that in the process of embracing and collecting the diverse stories and the process of the completing the full story, we needed to suggest what we should focus on and target on. And finally, I totally agree that WePIC will develop a first policy on interpretation and presentation, bridging over the ideal and the real. And also personally, I would like to know which particular parts Joseph doesn't like the e-commerce charter's definition. Thank you so much.
Many thanks to Hyun-kyung for sharing your thoughts. Probably Joseph can answer your question in the discussion part. So you also agreed to Joseph that we should put more attention to presentation, and also the interpretation should contain the complete story and multiple narratives of the heritage sites, as we should have a people-centered approach. And also we should have a balanced use of digital heritage and on-site interpretation as well. So thank you again for your 5-minute reflections. So before we go into our discussion, I would like to share the results of an interesting survey that we conducted recently. To commemorate the 50th anniversary of the World Heritage Convention, we did a one-word survey to various global heritage stakeholders. The question was, what is your keyword or idea for the next 50? So more than 140 people have participated, and the results are as shown on the screen. According to our analysis, The answers could be categorized into two pillars. The first is community engagement. This is expressed in many other terms, such as need of a local community, heritage for all, participation, community empowerment, heritage empathy, inclusivity, diversity, and coexistence. The other value is sustainability, such as sustainable heritage, sustainable development, climate crisis, and green network. It shows that these two pillars, which are core values to the heritage now, will still be significant to the future as well. This was a great opportunity to see what people in the heritage sector around the world think about the future agenda on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the convention. So this naturally leads to our first discussion question. That is, what issues do you think should be prioritized in future heritage interpretation and presentation policies, and why is that? So who can start first? Probably Joseph.
So you choose. You choose who goes first. I think to me, my first priority would be, and I sort of mentioned this already, but I want to emphasize it. My first priority would be in understanding that presentation is not just aimed at tourism, but it is actually aimed at local communities. I think it is of the utmost importance that there is a need for local communities, local people to be able to see themselves in the interpretation and the presentation. It shouldn't just be something aimed at people coming from the outside, but people living in a place should be able to recognize themselves and be able to feel like they are a part of this. And I'll give you just a quick example of this, because I live in Rome, as well, I guess as many of you know, because I work at ICCROM. My wife is Italian and is Roman, actually. I mean, her family comes from Rome. And her father used to be very passionate about his Romanness. And, you know, for him, walking around the city of Rome and going to the archaeological sites, going to museums, going to even the modern, you know, the modern heritage that's here in certain parts of Rome, he wanted to be able to see himself, and he wanted to be able to see Rome in the presentation and with the interpretation and the presentation of these various sites. And I learned from him how important that is for a person. This is not me coming from the United States and enjoying Rome. This is somebody who was born here, who was raised here, and who has a passion about everything Roman, and could tell you every street name, who the street was named after, and what their history was, etc. And I think it's really important to make sure that local communities can see themselves in this interpretation and presentation. So to me, that is actually one of the key priorities that we need to be working with. And I would say that some of those things like inclusion came up in your word cloud. So I'm happy to see that in fact actually it's something that a lot of people are thinking is important. Thank you.
Thank you. You also stressed that local community engagement and also inclusion is very important. And Gautam, okay, Hyungyung, please go ahead, Hyungyung.
I think it's like linking to Joseph King's point. I'd like to say, in order to more facilitate local people's engagement in presentation and interpretation, we needed to prioritize communication strategy as well. So how can we make a discussion with whom? So can we not neglect the marginalized voices? We are now aware of the importance of the marginalized voices, such as the indigenous people's stories and local people's stories that have been long enough neglected. As we can see that we really needed the urgent action in 1970s and 80s in order to save the World Heritage Site and heritage sites. But now we need a slow action to listen to the many people's stories in order to build up the heritage interpretation and presentation. So I'd like to emphasize it is the time to build up the communication strategies. And meanwhile, I'd like to mention that we needed to change the concepts because some people thought heritage interpretation provokes the dissonances between different stakeholders. So that can be harm the peace building that UNESCO pursues. But however, we needed to change the perception on that. So because it's like respecting multiple stories, and multiple stories doesn't harm the peace building at all. So we needed to redefine what peace means. Peace is also a process that many people can build up together. That peace is the process towards the solidarity. So according to the 1945 Constitution, mutual understanding is a very important point to avoid the war, but to pursue the peace. So I would like to emphasize heritage interpretation and presentation can be the process of the mutual understanding towards the peace building.
Thank you very much. I also agree with you that gathering multiple narratives doesn't necessarily create a dissonant heritage. And I think the core concept of presentation is there is a communication. So thank you very much for your opinion. So Gautam, do you also have something to say about this question?
Yes, there are. I'll start off first with elements of natural heritage. I feel the smaller beauties of nature, like wildflowers, butterfly, need special emphasis, as they may not catch the usual visitor's eye in terms of interpretation. A sense of the special respite that nature offers needs to be brought specifically into focus. Moreover, our cultural connections and dependencies on nature may not be obvious to urban visitors, as they usually do not have the connect that is needed to have with the nature. So appropriate means of communicating the same has to be developed. I feel that as a team, which includes WHIPIC, ICROM, ICMOS, IUCN, as well as Wildlife Institute of India Category 2 Center, we should work together on a white paper which may start taking cues from the ICMOS INAME heritage document on heritage interpretation, Joseph's 8 points. Maybe we also revisit Tilden and work out a policy for heritage interpretation. And in fact, we could also think of pushing forward a small section on heritage interpretation, specifically in the education and awareness section of operational guidelines document, and also probably section 8, which outlines the use of World Heritage emblem as an identifying sign for the World Heritage sites, where some specific cues for interpretation could be added. And of course, everybody is stressed it, right from Joseph to Hyung-yong, maybe James Carter, and also you, Harishan, that we need to consider multiple viewpoints of the different stakeholders that are going to visit that place. And we have to emphasize more on the local interpretation and not just cater to the outstanding universal values, which will capture the multiple viewpoints. And the idea here is to have more of a constructivist interpretation rather than the transmissive one, which we have been following for so long. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Gautam. You have many ideas about heritage interpretation. Thank you for offering the revisiting the INAME Charter and also making a small section under the operational guidelines. So I think it can be realized if we can work together in the future. So thank you very much for your answers. Our next question is, How can we assure that the significant values become a reality in future World Heritage policies and practices? Probably the same order. Joseph.
Thank you again. Thank you for that question. So how can we assure that these become a reality? And it's an interesting question. And I'll throw out two things that we can do to hopefully make this more of a reality. The first is bottom up, and the second is more top down. On the bottom up side, I think the first thing we need to do is we need to listen before we talk. We have a tendency, we're experts in the field, quote unquote, and we have a tendency to go into a place and immediately start telling people what they need to do and how they need to do it, and telling them that they don't really understand how this works and that we'll explain it to them. So I think the first thing that we need to do is stop with that approach, and we need to go in first and listen, because only if we listen will we actually be able to elicit the necessary understanding of these significant values and understanding these things that are important and that may be of crucial importance to communities and others, let's say. So I think that's the first thing. I think we need to adopt a listening approach to before an acting approach, and then when we get to the action approach, we then to make things a reality, we then need to do it hand in hand. We need to work together with people. And let me be clear, I mean, that's people at the local level, at the community level. It's also at the national level and at the international level. I mean, we need to be working together in order to make sure that these things become a reality. So that's, I think, one important thing. I think the second thing that I would like to emphasize, and this is specific to the World Heritage Convention and just something that we have to understand, and this is top down, not bottom up, is we have to understand that the World Heritage Convention is a state party convention. It's a state party driven convention. So if we want to accomplish anything in this convention, we have to do it through working more closely with states parties. As much as I want to work with communities, I need to be able to make sure that I can convince your state party, that I can convince Korea, or that I can convince the United States or Italy to actually adopt these things. And so the other thing is I need to work more closely with states parties, with national authorities, with professionals at the national level in countries, and with the World Heritage Committee as a whole, because we will only be able to do these things if ultimately states parties allow us to. The idea of putting things in the operational guidelines is a fantastic one. But if the committee doesn't agree to it, ECROM can scream, and continue to scream. IUCN can scream and continue to scream. But if the committee doesn't want to do that, they're not going to do that. ECOMOS can adopt a policy guidance. They have in 2008. But if the committee doesn't want to follow it, there's nothing that we can do to force them to follow it. So the other side, so on the one side, listen to the people, listen to the communities, listen to all of the stakeholders, and on the other hand, work hand in hand with states parties, with national professionals, with governments, to make sure that we can actually implement these things all the way across the board. So that's what it's going to take for us to make things a reality that we've been discussing today. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. Thank you for your down-to-earth, very practical suggestion and the answer. We totally agree with you about the listening to the community and the environment. WPIC is actually trying to preparing for the capacity building programs, but we will try to have a very enough time to listen to the most sites in Korea and in other world as well. So thank you for your answer. And Hyun-kyung, can you also go to the answer the question?
Yes, thank you very much. I'm really inspired by the other two presenter and discussants, and thank you. I'd like to suggest two things as well. The first, I'd like to focus on the word conservation. We needed to reinterpret conservation and World Heritage Convention and also operation guidelines. when my research team analyzed the keywords of the last 50 years regarding the World Heritage Convention and World Heritage Site, the conservation is one of the keywords throughout the entire 50 years. But we tended to think about the conservation is relating to physical conservation and preservation. But heritage interpretation is another word of the conservation of protecting and preserving the diverse values and stories. So if we persuade the state parties that there is a heritage interpretation presentation is another part, an expanded part of the conservation that World Heritage has endeavored, then we can definitely produce the actual implementation of the policy regarding heritage interpretation and presentation. And second, I agree with Joseph that we need a lot of conversation in the bottom-up processes. And meanwhile, James Carter and other people also talk about how the experts can talk with the local people and the visitors and the public side. But meanwhile, I'd like to emphasize we need more communication between heritage experts, because the heritage issues that UNESCO has been developed is also a little bit different from the core issues that heritage scholars have developed. So we needed to communicate each other between the UNESCO and actual practical sectors and academic sectors. And meanwhile, the junior scholar and senior and middle scholars needed to talk about how to reinterpret the core values of the UNESCO Heritage Convention. So I think it's like in order to bridge over the generational gap and also the disciplinary gap, we need more communications. Thank you.
Thank you, Hyun-kyung. Thank you. So you reiterated the importance of the basic principle of the importance of conservation, and also to avoid silos of the experts or academia. The experts should be communicated with the public and the community as well. So thank you, Gautam, please.
Yes, so I have been listening very carefully. As Joseph suggested, we have to listen, and I have followed his approach, both the top-down and bottoms-up. So first, for the top-down approach, I do realize that we need to convince the state parties, and it could be a very, very long drawn process. So the other idea which popped into my mind was, since interpretation is an ongoing iterative process and newer findings, fresh inputs regarding the use of heritage in local context would lead to values beyond OUVs, and we would have to continuously reevaluate heritage interpretation at a site on periodic basis. So keeping these thoughts in mind, we could at least start off with a best practice guide, and whether that is a feasible option, so that we translate whatever ideas we have. And I think we are well within our rights to do that. Whether people adopt it or not depends on the merit of the document. The second part, which is the bottoms-up approach, getting to involve the communities, I wish to bring your attention to a very specific group of community who are usually physically challenged, and getting interpretation right to them. And recently, I had a personal experience wherein we had to communicate natural heritage to people who are blind or who cannot hear. So they are deaf and dumb. And the realization that we communicate only with audio-visual means is such a big handicap was realized by me. We need to figure out ways to integrate touch, taste, smell, and in fact, even balance to interpret many of the natural heritage elements. And a quick example, after which I'll stop, is we asked this group of children who had come to us who could not figure out the audio-visual cues. We told them to touch a bark of a tree. We crushed the leaves, told them to smell it, told them to experience the taste, and in fact, also lead them through different places and feel that how uneven a terrain is and how you can easily lose balance, what you need to do. And communicating that context of natural heritage was so fulfilling. It was a big, big learning experience for us. So with this, I would like to stop. Thank you all for, providing so many good insights. And I'm really happy to have been a part of this event today.
Thank you, Gautam. I'm very grateful today to hear a voice from a natural heritage because your idea is very different from what we are usually sharing these days. So thank you for your wonderful ideas. So thank you all very much. Now I would like to take some questions from the public participants. Our audience has left their questions and comments on our YouTube and Facebook. So I'll address the first question. So the first question was from actually the staff of WIPIC. So I'll read the question. I'm very interested in hearing all the participants' opinions regarding the next 50 years of the World Heritage Convention. What does everyone think about the adaptability and flexibility of the World Heritage Convention, given that heritage and the communities involved are constantly in flux, but the foundational parts of the World Heritage Convention are mainly unchanged? It's very interesting and probably a difficult question for us. Yes, probably you need some minutes to think, or who can start first? Joseph or?
If you want me to go, I'll go.
Okay, thank you.
I think it's an interesting question, and I think it's actually a very it's sort of very well formulated, let's say, because I agree with you. There's a contradiction at play here. There's no doubt about it. The concepts of heritage have continued to evolve over time. I mean, we're talking about the evolution of interpretation and presentation, but I would say that the concepts of heritage in general, I mean, there's nothing in the convention that talks about urban environments, cities, things like that. It talks about groups of buildings. Our understanding has, changed significantly over time. And now we have the historic urban landscape. Now we have the links between culture and nature, which actually I'm also very happy to have somebody from nature on this panel, because one of the things that 25 years ago, when I started in this convention, and I've said this in many other places, so if anyone's listening that's heard me say it before, I apologize. But 25 years ago when I started in this convention, we used to go out and have a beer with our colleagues from IUCN, but we never collaborated on actual activities and projects and programs. And now we're doing a lot more collaboration in many ways. And I think so there are changes, there is adaptability, there is flexibility. Having said that, the World Heritage Convention is a convention, and it's signed by 100 and whatever it is, 194, 95, I can't remember, states parties now. And that's not flexible. It's not open to change. You can't change a convention. It is the constitution of the World Heritage System. And it's not, you can't make significant changes to that. So we're in a little bit of a contradiction here, let's say. And I think the way to do it ultimately is what you are doing right now at WIPIC, rethinking, creating policies, introducing ideas. I mean, I remember 20 years ago when we started talking about Indigenous people at the 2001 committee meeting in Helsinki, that the World Heritage Committee didn't want to hear it. I mean, they literally didn't really want to deal with that issue at all. Now it's in the operational guidelines. 10 years later, 12 years later, it actually managed to get itself in the operational guidelines. Now, that doesn't mean that everything is perfect in relation to that, and that still needs to be evolving into the future. But things are going to take time. We need to be patient about that, and we need to. That's why I'm saying we need to work with the state's parties. We need to slowly bring the operational aspects of we can't change the convention itself, but we need to slowly change the operational processes of the convention to match what are now the current practices in conservation. And it's a slow process, and it's an ongoing process, and we need to recognize that.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your answer. Also, Hyunkyung and Gautam, do you want to answer the question as well?
I have a quick reflection.
Mm-hmm.
That yes, the World Heritage Foundations have been quite static from the beginning, and there are certain elements which are changing over a period of time, at least in the operational guidelines, as pointed out by Joseph. However, I think we need to go a little faster on this. Primarily, we still have the distinction or the division of nature and culture being separate, and we try to link it, whereas that is not the case. Because there is nature, there has been culture, and because there is culture, it feedbacks into nature. We cannot actually have a separate distinction per se. So ideally for me, all sites are mixed sites only, and which have the nature and culture embedded into it. And we need to look forward from that perspective. The second perspective that I have is we are having new categories more and more, like mentioned, urban heritage landscape. In fact, now we have an intangible cultural, intangible heritage, which is there. So, which are coming under new conventions per se. And there is a need to synergize and embrace everything within the one heritage convention that we have. And though I strongly agree to Joseph that we cannot, change the convention overnight and state parties have to be brought on board, but it is organizations like us and the advisory bodies which have to keep on hammering the executive committee with the way we have to proceed. And this is the way things will change. And fortunately, I see changes happening over a period of time. So I am really hopeful for the next 50 years. I do want to leave this forum in a very, very positive light on that. Thank you.
Yes, the evolution of the convention would be very important for all of us as well. And Hyunkyung also.
Yeah,
yes.
I mostly agree with the two. I agree with the Joseph and Gautam, and yes, it's like some people denounces, oh, UNESCO is so conservative, they are so stubborn not to change anything. But however, I'd like to say that UNESCO, when UNESCO formed the UNESCO World Heritage Convention, that is a kind of bit revolutionary things to combine the conservation between culture and nature things. So I'd like to say that UNESCO's World Heritage Convention started with a very innovative thoughts. And also, although it is a bit slow, however, the World Heritage Operation Guidelines is very flexible and open to change as well. So it's like for example, the 4C strategies and 4-5 strategies are adopted in 2000s. That means the new values such as capacity building and communication and communities are also have become very important elements in World Heritage Operation Guidelines. So I'd like to say that I agree that somehow the convention shouldn't be changed, but however, the UNESCO World Heritage is open to change and also is ongoing to evolution. Thank you.
Thank you.
If I may jump in and say that, in fact, you pointed out a good point, the 4 Cs. The 4 Cs started out as 4 Cs, not 5 Cs. And it was actually in New Zealand that we added the community, the 5th C community to that. So there is room for change. there is room for slowly building things up, and I think we need to recognize that. But it all still has to be within the framework of a convention that we can't change the convention. So it's slow change. Sorry to interrupt.
No, it's okay. Yes, you're very right that at the 30th anniversary of the convention, we announced the 4 Cs, and then at the 40th anniversary, it announced the 4 Cs to 5 Cs. And so as Joseph has explained, I think we have interesting dynamics between the conservativeness and also the progressive voices as well. So there is a room for change. Thank you. And we got a second question from Facebook. So Blue Pararas left a comment. Hyun-kyung mentioned the value of authenticity in heritage, which has long been questions, i.e. the NARA document in 1994. How relevant do you think authenticity will continue to be interpretation, policy surrounding heritage interpretation? It was addressed to Hyun-kyung, but I think also Joseph and Gautam can answer after Hyun-kyung. So Hyun-kyung, can you go first to answer the question?
Thank you very much for the question. I'd like to introduce the new interpretation of the authenticity by Silverman in 2009. And then she said the contemporary version of the authenticity should include the people's engagements in the heritage sites, and how the people engaged in the sites, and then the new authenticity can be generated, and meaning also be newly generated. So in the context of the contemporary version of the authenticity, then people's participation and engagements in the heritage sites is very important. So as we discussed a lot, how many people's engagements in heritage interpretation and presentations are very much important. So therefore, the heritage authenticity will be evolved with the heritage interpretation presentation along with lots of people's engagement. That is my short response to answer your question.
Thank you. Gautam and Joseph, can you also answer to the question as well?
So I'll go first, Joe.
Sure, absolutely.
So my take on it is, as far as nature is concerned, everything is authentic unless it is a genetically modified stuff. And in fact, nature has to evolve continuously. And therefore, I find the notion of authenticity, I wouldn't say irrelevant, but at a very, very low priority. But having said that, the values of a system keep on changing over a period of time. And we need to actually figure out what we value most and accordingly assign authenticity value to it, because if a particular site changes too fast, too rapidly, without giving the people also to evolve and change their mindsets, it may not be the best possible option. So, I'll keep my response only to this much, because we normally don't deal with the authenticity part too much as when we consider natural heritage. For us, it is more about evolution.
Yes, thank you. Good to know that natural heritage has a different position about the authenticity. And Joseph?
Yeah, okay, thank you for that. And actually, I'm going to challenge you in a minute on that. Just to say, the concept of authenticity has evolved over time anyway. In the long distant past, it was really only talking about authenticity of the materials themselves. Is this the authentic brick that was used by the Romans to build this, to build this this building, and that that was really the initial basis of it. In the World Heritage Convention, in the operational guidelines, it started also talking about other things. It was authenticity of material, authenticity of setting, authenticity of use. I mean, there were four aspects, but actually in the question itself, it talks about the NAR document in 1994. The NAR document itself was already an evolution, if you will, in the concept of authenticity, because it started to bring other aspects into it. It started to bring spirit and feeling in, which was something that nobody really thought about before in relation to authenticity. So I think the concept is still continuing to develop, and I think it should. And as was pointed out, the idea of bringing community more into that, and that also being an aspect of authenticity, I think is something that we need to continue to develop. That where I'm going to challenge, however, is this issue of nature and authenticity. And I'm going to say it's interesting because in 2005, so for most of the life of well, no, it's not. Is it most anymore? Maybe not, because 15, yeah. So for most of the life of the convention, authenticity applied to cultural heritage sites, integrity applied to natural heritage sites, and cultural heritage sites were not looked at in terms of integrity, and natural sites were not looked at in terms of authenticity. In 2005, we halfway moved because cultural heritage sites now started also to be looked at in relation to their integrity. Because in fact, it's actually very useful for cultural heritage sites to be thinking about things, and we took the cue from the natural heritage side, to think about the wholeness and the completeness of a heritage site, and it's especially true for cultural landscapes. It's especially true for historic towns and cities and urban areas, but also even for buildings. So we actually moved toward that idea of applying integrity also for cultural heritage. At the same time, we started to talk to our colleagues on the nature side to see if the authenticity concept could also be relevant on the nature side. We've had some discussions on that. I actually led a session at one of the World Conservation Congresses at IUCN, questioning that question. Can authenticity in nature be something that would be useful for us in terms of management and conservation? It's never actually been resolved, but now the more I think about it, I actually think we do need to be talking about that a little bit more, because if I think of an ecosystem and a natural ecosystem, especially given the climate change that's happening, some of the real devastation that's happening and the significant changes that are happening in these ecosystems. Yes, obviously that is a part of natural systems. They change over time. There's no doubt about it. But some of these changes are happening so quickly, and the values for which we are associating particular ecosystems, particular landscapes, particular places, natural heritage places, are actually going to be undergoing significant changes due to these external factors in the near future. And I think we do need to be thinking about authenticity in that respect. And again, not in a negative way, but can we use this concept in one way or another to help us in planning and management of natural heritage places, recognizing that there are adaptations and changes and things that change over time. But I do think it might, and I don't know, we still need to have this discussion. It might be a useful tool that actually could be used, especially in these rapidly changing ecosystems that we're facing now. So I just want to throw that out there as a possibility for trying to move forward with these discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. Gautam, do you want to say something, or?
Yes. I would give a quick response to that. Point number one is, I said that I keep the authenticity on the low priority. And yes, it could go on a higher priority, no doubt about it. In the current context of thinking, including climate change could be an overkill. But where we try to introduce the concept of authenticity, or at least think about it, is how much is being changed by humans directly. So the direct interventions in changing an ecosystem. So if that is there, probably, we are compromising on the authenticity. However, getting climate change into the picture is we need to take a lot of states on board. You've mentioned it yourself, and I don't think it is going to be an easy process. And to tell you honestly, how we go ahead with that, these changing ecosystems over a period of time and, drawing thresholds, it is going to be an enormous challenge, even for all the technical organizations or advisory bodies who are working in this. So we need cutting edge science to actually think about it. Right now, we are ill-equipped to deal with that. So that's my take on it.
Thank you. It's very interesting conversation. So conventionally, the authenticity was less important in natural heritage, but the era of a climate crisis paradoxically gives the authenticity importance to the natural heritage as well. So thank you for your answers. And due to the time issue, I think this would be our last public question. So I'll address the question. Including diverse stakeholders is increasingly important, but there are also different perspectives by different groups on the same places. What do you think should be the principle in negotiating different and diverse views? I think that's because sometimes in the process of gathering different ideas and different voices, there's a possibility of the conflict and the dissonant heritage. So, yes. Since a difficult heritage and dissonant heritage is in your research interest, Hyun-kyung, do you want to go first?
Considering the time limit, I try to briefly answer that question. That is such an important issue. But for example, when the black slavery, enslaved histories has been and stories has been silenced for a long time, while the imperial power and imperial stories have been praised a lot. And so it's like people's stories have been kinds of bit more hidden, while the kinds of material achievements such as in the industrial revolution aspects or some victorious stories are praised. So kinds of if the conflicts stem from the historical revisionist is like a political ambition, then we needed to try to how to embrace two different stories, but we needed to very carefully think that if the diverse stories is like a rather distorts the original, is not original, but it's a bit harder to explain that. I know the truth, the word truth is very complicated and controversial or some problematic. However, some stories is like have some intention to like hurt other value, or some stories really ethically try to distort the certain perspectives, then probably we needed to be very careful whether it is accepted or not. So I think it's like a heritage, it's like a ethical issues to perceive the stories should be the one of the main principles to negotiate the stories. So I think it's like raises the marginalized voices, and including their voices is definitely necessary, is another issues, but we needed to think the intention of the behind the stories, whether that is from the building up the stories diversity, or is from the political ambitions or historical revisionist. So that is the kinds of important point to negotiate different perspectives. That is my personal opinions.
Thank you. So having ethical attitude towards the different voices and the heritage interpretation will be very important. And yes, Joseph.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I agree with that. I think the problem is that you can't dictate ethical approaches to other people and to other groups, and to specifically to political groups and people who want to have revisionist histories. I think. I mean, but I think we need to try, obviously, and I think again, my first my first word on this would be something that I said already, which is we need to learn how to listen better. So I think that's a skill that we need to have, is we need to have a skill of learning how to listen. And I say that because we need to make people understand that we're listening. I think one of the ways that you can create a more ethical space is actually by demonstrating a desire to say you do matter and your point of view matters. So I think listening does do that, to a certain point. But again, the problem is that if you've got actors who are not happy with each other, they're not necessarily going to listen to each other, and that's a problem. And this is actually something I've also been wrestling with for literally since I started working at ICCRUM. I started working at ICCRUM in 1996, 1997, and in the first course that we did on urban conservation. Normally in the past, prior to that, ICCRUM's courses would have dealt specifically with the subject matter: conservation of stone, conservation of wood, interpretation, whatever. Those sort of more technical heritage related things. In this course on urban conservation, we introduced an entire section of the course on negotiation and communication and negotiation, with the idea that especially in an urban context where you're not just conserving the stone in a building, but that you're actually dealing with people in a place, you need to be able to negotiate. You need to be able to be a facilitator, let's say, between groups. So I think one of the things that we need to do in order to be more inclusive is we actually need to train heritage professionals to be more negotiators, be more facilitators, be more able to bring diverse people into a room, make them feel comfortable enough. You're never going to be able to change certain people's ways of looking at things, but at least if you can create an atmosphere where people feel like they can discuss with each other, that's at least a step in the right direction. To be honest with you, it's not going to solve it, because if you've got somebody with a particular political agenda, and that's their agenda, they're not going to go to that ethical space, that you mentioned. But if we can at least create as much as possible, that ethical space and be able to negotiate and be able to sort of try to slowly bring the differing viewpoints into the same room and get them to listen to each other, because it's not just us listening. We also need to get them to listen to each other. I think that's the only way that we can go forward. And again, it's not a silver bullet. It's not going to solve the problem, but I think it's at least we can create steps in the right direction in order to deal with this issue.
Okay, thank you. Yes, one, ethics can be also ethical to others is also a question, I think. It's universality. Thank you very much for your answer. Gautam, have you also experienced these ethical issues in your sector as well?
Yes, though it is quite different from the way Yong and Joseph have put it, and I do completely agree to their thoughts. I am completely in sync with them. In fact, we follow something similar even in natural heritage. I'll just give you some anecdotes, and which will probably help explain stuff better. I recently was in a tiger reserve called the Pench Tiger Reserve. I was mesmerized after seeing the tiger. At the same time, I was bitten by ticks and mosquitoes, and I have been itching all over my body for the last 2 months. So I have got two experiences, two sets of interpretations with me only. So one is of the pleasure, and the other is, of course, the itching by the caused due to ticks is also another kind of pleasure. You derive a lot of pleasure after itching. But you tend to get infected. So you do have multiple kinds of interpretation of the same place. And there is no point in trying to, harmonize or negotiate, because these are stuff which are true. And each person has got full right to have his or her own interpretation or construct as they choose to. However, having said that, I'll take another example wherein there is a human-wildlife conflict between the tiger and the human or the livestock, where the local livestock is taken by the tiger or a human is killed in a conflict. And of course, the person who has borne the brunt of the conflict would have a complete different kind of an interpretation. And that story is also true, that narrative is true, as well as for a visitor who comes from outside, from the cities, who is mesmerized by the tigers, and the only reason he has come to see a tiger in a natural heritage is also a very positive kind of a story or a narrative. And we say tiger is the apex species, umbrella species, which conserve the ecosystem. So there is another kind of narrative here. And here we do try to negotiate. In a situation like this, which kind of a narrative needs to get a priority. And for the local villagers, who's usually bearing the brunt of all the conflicts that happen because of nature, we try to bring in a story which says that, this is originally the tiger's land, and they have been inhabiting this place much before than you have. So ideally, we are the people who are encroaching into their space. So this is how we try to negotiate some things. I'm not saying that we are successful all the time, but we should try to do this. Thank you.
Thank you. You had a very different situation, but you also had the same ethical issues, and also you applied a method of negotiation. Well, thank you all for today. Many thanks to Joseph, Gautam, and Hyunkyung taking your time for the webinar, and to all our global audiences as well. It was a fruitful discussion on what we can do for the next 50 as we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the World Heritage Convention. Before closing today's event, I would like to let you know that WIPIC will be holding the first international forum for heritage interpretation and presentation on 15th and 16th of November. That's next week. Many diverse thoughts on heritage interpretation will be gathering on the theme of sustainability. It will be live streamed as well on our YouTube channel. So please check our social media for the further information. So thank you so much again for your interest and support for the series throughout the year. We'll be back with an upgraded program next year. So take care, and we will see you in a few months. Bye, everyone.